Well, hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Evenbreak webinar today on the benefits of employing disabled people. Great to see so many of you here. This is a series of events that we run for employers. One of our missions at Evenbreak is for employers to become more inclusive and accessible, so that obviously disabled people can thrive in your organizations, and more importantly, that you can access that talent, which is such an amazing untapped pool of talent. So I hope you enjoy the webinar today. I'm Jane Hatton, for those of you who haven't met me. I'm founder and CEO of Evenbreak, and we are a social enterprise, and we are run by and for disabled people. So everybody who works at Evenbreak are disabled themselves. And so, yeah, this is one of our many events that we offer to support employers. So you're very welcome. You'll see that we have the lovely Gemma here, who's our BSL interpreter, and we also have live captionings on. So if you want to access those, you can click on the bit at the bottom for that. And we've supply these, not necessarily because anybody's asked for them, but because we think it's good practice to make everything that we do accessible without having to rely on people telling us what they need. Obviously, if people have additional access needs, we'll do our best to accommodate those. But what we like to do is to just assume that everything should be accessible for everybody as a matter of right. So they're there if you need them. So again, a very, very warm welcome. We're going to go through some slides. I'm going to share my slides, my screen in a moment with you. We have a chat function on the bottom of the screen that you'll see. So if you have any questions or any comments or just anything you'd like to add, maybe you've got examples of good practice that you'd like to share, please jot those down in the chat. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, if you want to raise your hand, at the moment you're muted, but Toby, who is supporting me on the tech today, will be able to unmute you so you can ask your questions. So either write something down in the chat or raise your hand if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make. And I will be hopefully making this a little bit interactive. So I'm just going to share my screen. And one of the things I wanted to really to say is that today will be quite a bit about storytelling, as well as giving you some facts and figures, because I think stories can tell the story just as much as statistics can. So hopefully there'll be a bit of a mix of both in this today. So we're looking at the benefits of employing disabled people. And it might seem a given, and I'm assuming that to some extent I'm preaching to the converted on this call, because what we tend to find is that people who come to this kind of event are already on board and already understand some of the benefits and are keen to learn more. Actually, sometimes we would like other people to attend these events that perhaps don't yet understand the benefits of employing disabled people. And this is something we come across at Evenbreak quite a lot. So obviously in our day-to-day life here, we talk to employers a lot about diversity. And I think if, 10, 15 years ago, I'd been talking to businesses and companies about diversity, they would have said, well, it's not really relevant to us. We're a business. We don't need to think about diversity. But I'm really pleased to say that things have changed over those years, and actually diversity is much more of a business issue now than ever it was seen to be before. And so sometimes when I talk to companies about diversity, they'll be quite enthusiastic, and they'll be telling me about what they're doing on gender and maybe what they're doing on race. And if I'm really lucky, maybe what they're doing on LGBTQI+. And when I look up on the internet for images that are called diversity, I get something like this. So apparently, in order to be diverse, you have to have impossibly white teeth. But there's no visible disability there. And so I think, diversity is still seen as something that's about race and gender. And when people tell me about all of the stuff they're doing on race and gender, and I say, that's great, that's really good to hear. What are you doing on disability? And the whole tone of voice changes, and it's kind of, Disability. Such a shame for those people. We really ought to, and I kind of interrupt and say, no, this isn't about pity or charity. And, this is about talent. And there's a kind of, I think, perception about disability that we're all kind of pathetic objects of pity, or maybe benefit scroungers. But there's a kind of pity change of tone of voice around it. So when I challenge and say, no, actually, we're not talking about pity or charity here, we're talking about talent that your organization could benefit from. And then they kind of say, oh, yes, no, of course, yes, yeah, no, we get that. But actually, if you think about employing disabled people, this is what they will say. Actually, disabled people aren't going to be as productive, are they? So we can't really afford to have unproductive people in our organizations. Or they'll say, well, it's great, but it's too expensive. We're going to have to put lifts in and ramps in, and it's just going to cost us a fortune. We can't afford to do that. And, we already have problems with sickness absence, and we can't have disabled people because they'll always be going off sick, won't they? And they're going to be a health and safety risk. We're going to be tripping up over the wheelchairs. Blind people are going to be tripping up and walking into things. And of course, disabled people won't have skills, will they? And we really need skilled people in our business. So although we want to help these poor people, actually, we can't do it because it's a business risk for us, and it's just not something that we should be thinking about. I was once doing a talk, a live talk, and someone took a photograph of me doing the talk, and this slide was up in the background, which didn't make Evenbreak look very good, because it looked as though we were saying that these things were true, which of course we know they're not. But before I go on to dispel some of those myths, I just wanted to remind us about what we mean about disability. And I'm sure that many of you on this call or watching this recording will already be familiar with the different models of disability. But I think it's always a good thing just to refresh our memories and just kind of, put a foundation about what we're going to be talking about, later on in this webinar. So typically, disability has been seen very much as a medical issue. So in this particular image, which is to describe a man in a wheelchair at the bottom of a flight of stairs he's clearly not going to be able to get up, the medical model would say he's the problem. He's the problem because the rest of us can get up those stairs and he can't. So the solution to the medical model is to fix the problem, and the problem is seen as the person. Now, as you can probably see, there's a few problems with a medical model. One is that there will be people who can't be fixed, or perhaps don't want to be fixed, and why should they be fixed? It may be that none of us on this call are able to make this bloke walk up those stairs. So actually the medical model doesn't serve us well at all. And the medical model really says that disabled people themselves are the problem, and that the problem that needs to be fixed. There is an alternative to the medical model. It's much, much more empowering. It's the social model. So the social model says, actually, this bloke isn't the problem. The problem is the stairs. If this building had lifts or ramps, or people could bring down to him whatever he was going upstairs to do, then he wouldn't be disabled. He's not disabled by his wheelchair or by his inability to walk upstairs. He's disabled by the stairs. So that's a complete turnaround. What we're saying is, with the social model, the disabled person isn't the problem. The problem are the barriers that we face in society. And although this is a very obvious example, so we're talking about someone in a wheelchair and stairs, so that's quite easy to understand. Actually, the social model speaks to any disability, any condition that means that people can't participate in life, in society, in the same way as other people can. So, for example, if we have an inaccessible website, then that's a barrier to people perhaps with sight impairment, or someone who can't use a keyboard or can't use a mouse. So what we need to do with the social model is actually identify what the barriers are that are disabling people and remove those barriers or provide alternatives. So in the case of the man in the wheelchair, alternatives might be, let's provide lifts so he doesn't need to go up the stairs, or ramps, or let's make sure that the things he needs to access are on the ground floor, so that he doesn't need to go upstairs. So we need to remove the disabling barriers, excuse me. And so the social model is really empowering for all of us. It's empowering for disabled people because it means that all of a sudden we're not seen to be the problem. And for many of us, we've been treated as though we were the problem, for as long as we've been disabled. And that's, not very empowering for us. You're the problem because you're different from everybody else and not as good as everybody else. Whereas the social model says, actually, we're all different and we all face barriers. And the way to make the world fair isn't to try and change people, it's to try and change the environment that we live in. So we have accessible buildings, accessible transport, accessible websites, accessible information, accessible recruitment processes. And that's empowering because it means that from a disabled person's perspective, I'm not the problem. The problem is that the world we live in was designed by non-disabled people for non-disabled people. And actually, there are barriers that need to be removed. But it's also really empowering for everybody. So everybody on this call, everybody who's watching this recording, there are things that we can do that will remove those barriers. So what we want to do is not try and make this guy walk. It's actually make sure that he can access everything in the same way that everybody else can. Might mean doing things differently. That's fine. And what we'll see, I think, as we go through this webinar is that those things that we put in place to make the world more accessible and inclusive for disabled people actually make it much more inclusive and accessible for everyone. So if we think, for example, of buildings where there are automatic doors, so you press a button and the door opens, yes, that's great for somebody who uses a wheelchair. It's also great for someone who's pushing a buggy. It's also great for someone who's carrying heavy stuff and haven't got any hands free to open the door and can open the door by pushing the button with their elbow. So actually, although it might have been designed to help wheelchair users get around the building, it's going to help everybody. And that's the whole thing about inclusion and accessibility, that actually it makes the world better for everybody. There's no downside. It actually makes the world much more inclusive for anybody. So I just wondered if you wanted to put in the chat whether this is something that you've come across before. Am I telling you about the social model that you already know? Or is it a new concept for you? And if so, what does it bring you? Were there any things here that might inform what you do or actually make you think about disability slightly differently? It would be really interesting to hear any experiences that you have. So had you heard of the social model before? Don't be shy. Well, I'm going to assume that the silence means that it is something that you're familiar with, in which case that's absolutely great. And so I'll move on to the next slide. So everything we do at Evenbreak, oh, there's a question come up. Let's have a look. Okay, so Christian hasn't heard of it before. Yeah, no, it is insightful, isn't it? It's when I first heard about it, it kind of rocked my world, if you think, because it just turns the whole thing on its head. And then we've got in the chat, I'd heard of the social model, but not the medical model. So yeah, good to get a breakdown. And yes, okay, so this was well explained and you'd use this example. I mean, the example with the wheelchair and the stairs is a very kind of crude example in a way, because it's an obvious one, but I think it really makes sense. And it's really a way to kind of understand the difference between the medical model and the social model. So yeah, thank you for that. That's great. So some of the facts and figures. So again, this is going to be a little bit interactive. So first question, what do you think is the percentage of disabled people who use wheelchairs? So if you just want to jot that down in chat, how many people as a percentage do you think use wheelchairs? Again, it might be something that this group knows. So we've got 5%, we've got 8%. Yeah, I knew this would be, I'd be preaching to the converted here. Okay, so yes, it's around 5%. It's certainly less than 8%. And that's an interesting one, because I used the analogy of a wheelchair just now when I talked about disability and the social model. And when you think of the sign for disability, it's somebody in a wheelchair. And yet, actually, people who use wheelchairs are a very small minority of disabled people. And it's interesting because when I talk to employers sometimes, there's a kind of perception that, nearly all disabled people use wheelchairs. And I remember a talent acquisition director talking to me once who was in the hospitality sector. And I was telling them all about Evenbreak and what we do and how talented our candidates are. And I remember her saying, well, that's all very well, but people in wheelchairs can't wait at tables. And I remember thinking, well, waiting at tables isn't the only job you have within, your organization, because at hospitality there, it was a hotel chain. So they'll have, IT people, procurement people, HR people. But the assumption was that a disabled person would be waiting at tables. And then also, as I said to them, okay, so that's maybe 95% of, that's maybe 5% of disabled people you can't employ in that particular role. What about the other 95%? And so it's trying to get across to people that disability isn't just about ramps and lifts, although those things are important. And then the other thing, of course, to note is that not all wheelchair users are permanent wheelchair users. So some people will have some mobility. And I don't know if you've seen them, but sometimes we see on social media, photographs of somebody in a wheelchair in a supermarket, say, getting out of the wheelchair to get something from a high shelf and then sitting back down in the wheelchair. And there's all this, this person's a benefit fraud and a cheat and all the rest of it. And it may well be that that person has a heart condition or fatigue or chronic pain, or a number of different things, which will mean that they perhaps can walk for certain distances, but not for very long, which is why they use their wheelchairs. And actually, it's no different from anybody else using a car to take us somewhere that's too far for us to walk. So if I want to get to somewhere 10 miles away, I'm likely to use public transport or drive to get there rather than walk, because it's too far for me to walk. It's going to take too long. So somebody using a wheelchair is just using their wheelchair in the same way as other people might use cars. And so, yes, some people will be, a wheelchair user won't be ambulant at all, but many people will be. So it's all those kind of myths and things that we need to just be aware of. Okay, so the percentage of people who were born with their condition, percentage of disabled people who were born with their condition, any ideas on that one? Oh, bit more variety here. 17%, 45%, 25%, 30%. Bit of variety there. Yeah, it's about 17%. So 83% of disabled people weren't born with our conditions. We developed them as adults. And if I look at our team at Evenbreak, that holds true. There are many people within our team who weren't born as a disabled person, but then became disabled. So, for example, we have two people who lost their sight, one as a teenager, one as an older adult. We have someone whose hearing loss started when they were 4, but deteriorated over the years. And so it's an interesting one, because sometimes disabled people can become disabled overnight. So we have a member of our team who is a wheelchair user who had a car accident and broke his neck, and now uses a wheelchair and has some paralysis. It's an incomplete fracture, but he uses a wheelchair. He has issues with his hands and arms, and that was kind of an overnight. 1 minute he's not disabled, the next minute he's disabled. And then there are other people like our COO who became deafened over a period of time. And that happens with lots of disabled people. So we may develop MS, or we may have an accident, or we may develop cancer or whatever it might be. So most of us weren't born with our condition, we developed it as adults. And again, when we're looking at disabled candidates in terms of our organizations, 83% of disabled candidates who are applying for the job will have had the same diversity of education and qualifications and work experience as everybody else, but then something happens. And also, we know, and we'll see later on, that the 17% of people who were born with their condition actually very quickly develop and grow up knowing strategies to manage that condition and to thrive either despite it or because of it in some cases. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So how about the percentage of people with hidden conditions? So those people who are disabled but don't look disabled. What do you think? 80%, 70, 70. You're good, you lot. 65, 80. Yeah, great. Along the right lines. It's between 80 and 90%. The vast majority of disabled people don't look disabled, whatever looking disabled might look like. So if you think about it, people who are deaf, who have mental health conditions, who have a learning disability, who have chronic pain, who have diabetes, who are autistic, none of those people will show outward signs necessarily visibly of their condition. So most of us have hidden conditions. And what that means is that you will have interacted with far more disabled people than you are aware of, because many people won't look disabled and won't tell you about it because often there's no need to. And it's really quite reassuring for recruiters and for hiring managers and for talent acquisition people to know that you are already dealing with far more disabled people than you're aware of, which takes some of the mystery away and some of the fear away, because many of us are disabled but may not have mentioned it. So I have a spinal condition. When it's bad, if you could see me walk, you'll notice that I'm walking differently. But just here on this call, I don't think I look as though I have a chronic pain condition. I'm wearing glasses, which means I've got slight sight impairment, but that's not quite what I'm talking about here. So yes, most disabled people don't look disabled, whatever looking disabled feels like. So, okay, the disability employment gap in the UK, what do you think that might be? So this is the percentage of non-disabled people in work compared to the percentage of disabled people who are in work. What's that gap, do you think? It's talked about quite a bit on the news, I think, but there's a disability employment gap. It's around 30%. So roughly 80% of non-disabled people are in work, and around 50% of disabled people are in work. So there's a 30% gap between that. And I think that's quite shocking. You know, there's no reason why disabled people shouldn't be just as good in employment as everybody else. And we'll be looking at this later on. But actually, it's around 30%. And what's even more shocking is that it's been around 30% for decades. We're not really making any progress. The way the government calculate their figures is slightly distorted. So they're not taking, for example, into consideration that more people are becoming disabled and recognizing that they're disabled, which distorts the figures slightly. But the employment gap is, pretty constant, which is, I think, shocking. It means that if you're disabled, you're twice as likely to be unemployed than if you're not disabled. So, okay, it's 30% in the UK. What do you think it might be in the States, for example? Do you think it might be better or worse? 35? Any others? 50? Pretty close. It's about 47%. So they are not doing as well as we are. So even though the 30% is, I think, quite shocking, one of the more shocking things is that that's one of the better disability employment gaps in the world. So if you look at, say, the USA, it's around 47%. If you look at somewhere like India, it's 70 to 80%. And so we have a lot of work to do both in the UK and globally in terms of closing that disability employment gap. So yeah, I just thought I'd share some of those figures with you because I think it can be interesting sometimes to know what the what the situation is. But let's go back to looking at the benefits of employing disabled people. So when employers talk to me about, oh, well, we can't employ them because of this, that, and the other, those are myths. I can see why people think that, because if you look at the media and you look at the legislation and you look at the government, you could be, forgiven for believing that disabled people are objects of pity and pretty useless and not very good at doing stuff, because that's how we're portrayed. The model I didn't talk about earlier when I talked about the medical and social model is the charity model. And the charity model is very much about disabled people are people who need help. And it's the job of non-disabled people to help disabled people. And in order to get people to donate money to charities, they have to really play on this pity kind of narrative. And that's quite damaging because it makes disabled people look as though we have no agency, no self-determination, no ability to do things for ourselves or make decisions for ourselves. And so, what's the reality? When we look at disabled people in the round, generally disabled people, what can we and can't we do? Well, of course, it's incredibly diverse. One of the things that we know employers are struggling with at the moment is talent. There are incredible labour shortages, skill shortages as a result of the pandemic, as a result of Brexit, as a result of all sorts of things. And we know that in every sector now, there are really severe skill shortages and organisations are struggling to get the right talent. There are more jobs around than there are people looking for work. And so what that means is that organisations are having to look in new places. So if you have skill shortages, and we know that the percentage of working age population who are disabled is around 20%. So 1 in 5 of your talent pool is a disabled person. And if we're going to ignore that 1 in 5, that's an awful lot of talent that we're missing out on. And so ignoring that fifth of the talent pool just makes no business sense whatsoever. So we're looking at broadening our talent pool so that we can attract more talent. That's a huge one at the moment in these times of skill shortages. Also, if we look at things like productivity, one of the things that I think organisations worry about is, well, it'd be nice to take on disabled people, but they're not going to be as productive, and we are a business, not a charity. So really, can we? So what do you think then as a group? What do you think here today? Are disabled people on average, because of course everybody is different, but on average, are we less productive than non-disabled people, as productive as non-disabled people, or more productive? What would you think? Again, you want to put it in the chat. As productive, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's correct. So when we look at on average, disabled people, lots and lots of studies that have shown this, are on average just as productive as non-disabled people. So if that's the average, what that means is that many disabled people must be more productive than non-disabled people in order to get that average. And if you think about it, that's not actually surprising. So for example, someone who is autistic may not get involved in the office gossip because they're busy focusing on what they're doing. They're going to be more productive. Someone who is deaf will find it hard to be distracted by what's going on around them. So they're likely to be more productive. Someone who uses dictation software, so they're speaking to the computer and it types what they say, they're likely to be quicker and more accurate than people who aren't using that software, because the software doesn't make typos or spelling mistakes or grammatical errors, and it works at the speed of somebody's speech. So there will be significant numbers of disabled people who are more productive than non-disabled people. And as an employer myself who only employs disabled people, I can absolutely confirm that definitely the people who work at Evenbreak are incredibly productive and talented. So actually, when we talk about productivity, if an employer says we can't employ disabled people because they're not productive, that's a myth. There will be some who aren't as productive, but then there will be non-disabled people who aren't as productive. And so that certainly is a myth and doesn't bear out in practice. And then in terms of sickness absence, a lot of employers are worried that disabled people will be off sick, quite a lot. And if that's the case, why would we want to employ people who are going to be off sick all the time? So what do you think? Disabled people, do we have more time off sick than non-disabled people, the same amount of time, or less time off sick on average? What do you reckon? The same, less time, less. Yeah, it is less time off sick, which is a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? We tend to think of disability equaling illness, and actually health and disability aren't necessarily linked. And so on average, disabled people actually have up to 30% less time off sick than non-disabled people. So if we're worried about having a team of people who are always going to be off sick, what we need to do is employ more disabled people. Now, of course, this is averaged out, and there will be disabled people who do need time off for counselling or physiotherapy or whatever it might be. But on average, we have significantly less time off sick. And actually, although that's counterintuitive, if you think about it, someone who is blind or an amputee or deaf, why would they be more likely to get a cold or a chest infection or a tummy bug than anybody else? Well, they're no more likely, no more likely or less likely. But by the definition of the social model that we talked about before, most disabled people are already facing barriers when we're in the workplace, whether that's fatigue, whether it's side effects from drugs, whether it's having to do things in a different way. So actually, if we then get a cold or a headache or whatever it might be, we're going to cope with it because that's what we're used to doing. We're used to coping with things that aren't ideal. And so we just tend to push on through. So we do tend to have less time off sick. In a way, that's a problem because I would rather people be off sick when they are ill. And at Evenbreak, the problem isn't people having time off sick all the time. It's actually saying to people, will you just stop working and go to bed because you're not well? And actually trying to persuade people to take time off sick when they should. So again, the argument about disabled people being off sick all the time actually doesn't bear out in reality. Although I'd hate you to say to a disabled employee who did go off sick, but we were told you didn't go off sick because, of course, we're all human beings. And then workplace accidents, that's another worry that organizations have. What about, tripping up over wheelchairs? What about blind people walking into things? What about, so what do we think? Do disabled people on average have more workplace accidents than non-disabled people, the same amount or fewer? Fewer, question mark? Any others? It is actually fewer, yeah. And again, that might sound counterintuitive, but if you think about it, someone who knows that they are more likely to have an accident are going to put things into place to stop it from happening. So we are going to make sure that we don't have an accident. So for example, someone who is blind will do things like memorize the office and where things are. They may have a guide dog, they may have a cane. They will devise ways to keep themselves safe because they know that, these things might happen. And I say that, but actually not long ago, one of our team who is blind and goes running fairly regularly, goes with a sighted runner. And the sighted runner ran them into a lamppost, which didn't do much good to our colleague, but all due respect to him, he did carry on running after that. I think I would have given it up for good. But generally speaking, we do have fewer accidents. In my particular case, I have a very fragile spine, which is, it could become even more damaged than it is quite easily. So if I fall over and damage my neck further, it could be that I'd lose the use of my hands and arms. I'd rather not do that, given the choice. And so I make absolutely certain I don't fall over. I'm much more careful perhaps than I was before I became disabled. And, I've learned the very enviable skill of staying either upright or horizontal when I've had a couple of bottles of wine. I don't do that falling over bit in between. So that's another skill I have, which is probably not great in the workplace, but just to mention. So in terms of marketing, we know that disabled people and our families spend more than £250 billion a year. And that's a huge amount of money for organisations to be missing out on. And so having disabled people within our organisations that have lived experience of being disabled means that we can really help the organisation to attract that market better. So whether we're talking about, I don't know, a retailer making sure that shops and goods are accessible to disabled people, whether we're in the hospitality industry and we want to make sure that people can come and eat or drink if they're disabled, and bring their families with them, or whether it's we're designing products to sell, we need to make sure that those are accessible. Or if we're a public sector organisation, we need to make sure that the services that we deliver are accessible to all of the residents that we're there to serve. Whether that's a government agency or a local authority or a hospital or whatever it may be, we need to make sure that the services we provide are accessible to everyone. So it makes sense to have disabled people working within our organisations who can tell us about what the barriers might be that disabled people face. And so what it means is that we're opening up that market and we become much more profitable because we have a bigger customer base. So if you think about it, it's not just the disabled people themselves, because we tend not to go places on our own any more than non-disabled people do. So if I'm going to a restaurant and it needs to cater for my needs, everybody that I'm with on that outing is going to go to the same restaurant that I go to. It needs to be an accessible place. So it's not just me that you would be missing out on if your restaurant isn't accessible. It's also all the friends or family that would come with me, who will all be going with me to somewhere that's accessible. So in terms of, that we're not talking about pink and fluffy stuff here when we talk about the business benefits of employing disabled people. This is about cold, hard cash and marketing, and who would want to miss out, on all of those customers and clients. And it may be that we're dealing with people in other organizations who are disabled. So even if we're business to business, we need to make sure that we're accessible. And then there are additional skills. So I mentioned the social model earlier on. So disabled people are all very diverse. We are all different from each other, different personalities, different conditions, different barriers, different ways of coping, different ways of managing. But the one thing that all disabled people, by the social model definition, have in common is that we face barriers that other people don't. And so that means that we have to develop ways of navigating around those barriers. So if we take, for example, I mentioned a member of our team who is a wheelchair user. Let's say they want to go into town for some reason to meet a friend, let's say. In order to get there, most of us would either just jump in the car and drive there, or jump on a bus or a tube or train or whatever and get there and not even think about it. For someone who has mobility issues, that outing has to be planned like a military exercise. So, okay, if I'm going to drive, is there going to be an accessible parking space when I get there where I can get the wheelchair out? How far is it from the car park to the building I want to get to? And is that journey accessible? And when I get to the building, will I be able to get in the building? Is it accessible? Or if I'm going on public transport, how do I know that I need to make sure that the station I get on is wheelchair accessible and that the station I get off is wheelchair accessible? But what happens if I get off at a tube station that's normally wheelchair accessible, but the lift isn't working today? I'm going to have to know which other station to get to that I can use a lift to get back to that place I'm going. So I have to think about, how am I going to manage each stage in this process? I've got to think about if things go wrong at each stage in this process, and I'm going to have to put in plans, contingency for what happens if things go wrong. Those are project management skills. And for most disabled people, they are things we have to do all the time. We have to think ahead, plan ahead, think about what goes wrong, think about what support we need, maybe plan ahead to make sure there's somebody there to meet us, whatever it might be. We develop those project management skills just in terms of going about our everyday life. And actually, those skills are really useful for organizations. Why wouldn't we want people who think about things in that meticulous way and make sure that if things go wrong, we've got something in place to put it right. So those are, priceless really for organizations. We also have to develop problem solving skills. So we can't always do things the same way that non-disabled people can. So we're going to have to think about different ways of solving that problem. And for example, for the first 7 years when I was disabled, I wasn't able to sit at all. I either had to lie down or stand up. I wasn't able to sit. And so I was running a business where I needed to use a computer, but I can't sit down. So I went to Access to Work and said, you must have come across people like me before. How do people who can't sit down work? And they said, no, we haven't come across anybody like you before. Actually, we think everybody can sit, because if you're in a wheelchair or whatever, everybody can sit. No, they can't. So I had to come up with asking other people about, what can I do? And this is going back a good few years now. We're talking about maybe 20 years ago. Height adjustable desks are quite common now. They weren't a thing then. And so I had to go and source one, which was incredibly expensive, difficult to source because they weren't commonly available, make sure that it could be brought to the office I was then working in. And so I had to think about also when I'm lying down, how do I use the computer? So we manufactured things that were jerry built just to make sure that I had a way of suspending a laptop in front of me, above me, so I could work lying down. I had to come up with those problem solving skills that, I had to invent on the spot. And actually all disabled people have to do that. How am I going to communicate because I don't communicate in ways that others do? Or how am I going to use this software because I can't see in the way that others do? Or how am I going to navigate this website because it doesn't work in the way that it might do for others? So we develop those problem solving skills. And again, as an organization, we want people full that can be problem solvers. Creative thinking, again, is linked to the problem solving. I can't do it in the conventional way, so I'm going to have to think creatively and do it differently. And that's also a skill that we have to learn. And unless we're happy to stay in bed all of the time, we have to get determination. And we know that often we'll try things that don't work, or we'll come against barriers that we haven't anticipated, or something that we've planned, something goes wrong. And so we develop that kind of resilience and that determination and persistence that if the first thing we try doesn't work, okay, well, let's try it this way then, or that doesn't work, let's try it this way, and have to keep going back and being determined and persistent. And again, as an employer, what you want in your workforce are people who are determined and don't run away at the first sign of a problem. And so that's something that, is really important. And then it's that different perspective. So looking at things differently. Our team meetings are really interesting. So we might come up with a problem and come up with a solution, but then somebody will say, but that doesn't work for me. That wouldn't work in our organization. It's not going to work. So we have that different perspective, and that's really beneficial as well. And in fact, at Evenbreak, we call our candidates premium candidates, because if they're disabled, they will have developed all or most of these skills. And that means that we bring the same diversity of skills and talents and strengths and qualifications and experience as everybody else in the population, plus all of these things. So we look at disabled candidates as being premium candidates. And then there are other skills that are specifically related to particular disabilities. So we know that neurodiverse people think in different ways, and that can be so helpful. We have a number of neurodiverse people who work at Evenbreak and who come up with ideas that I would never have come up with in a million lifetimes. And so they may solve problems in different ways. They may look at the ways of doing things differently, and it's absolutely a business imperative. I think every organization needs neurodiverse people within it, because it challenges that groupthink. It challenges that, we do it this way because we've always done it this way. Someone who is neurodiverse might say, yeah, but why have you always done it that way? Because actually you could do it this way, and it might be something that none of us have ever thought of. So challenging that status quo can be really, really beneficial to an organization. And then there are some quite quirky ones. There was a doctor in France, who discovered that Braille readers, so people who read Braille, have very, very sensitive fingertips, and they used them to test breasts for possible lumps. And it turned out that the Braille readers were much, much better at detecting lumps than doctors were, because their fingers were so sensitive. Who would have thought of that? And somebody with hearing loss tends to be pretty good at noticing non-verbal communication. So our COO is deafened, and she lip reads, but she also notices facial expressions and body language much, much better than I do. And sometimes we'll have had a meeting with someone and she'll say, did you notice such and such? Or did you notice? No, I didn't notice it. But she does, because she has that ability to notice that non-verbal communication, which helps her to hear. So that's great. Also, her being a lip reader is incredibly useful. We've gone to exhibitions before, and our competitors have been on different stands. She's able to lip read and tell us what they're saying to their people. So that's always, maybe that's a bit of a naughty one I shouldn't have shared. And then another one is that we're noticing increasingly, particularly in hospitality and in retail, is that people with Down syndrome seem to engender positive reactions in people. So we'll notice at a supermarket, if somebody with Down syndrome is helping to pack bags, the queue for that particular checkout will be much longer than the other checkouts, not because the person is slow, but because people want to have that interaction. People who are working in restaurants and retail places are, you want someone who's friendly, who's attentive, who's smiling, and that tends to be what happens. I can remember in another life, I'm a patron of inclusive skills competitions, and one of the competitions was around hospitality. And there was a cafe, and there was a young man with Down syndrome who was a meter and greeter, and he was amazing. So he came to the door, he greeted me, he asked my name, he told me his name, he took me to my table, he used my name all the time, he remembered it. He would come back and say, is everything all right, Jane, because he remembered my name. And I remember thinking at the time, if I had a cafe, if that was my business, I'd want to employ him. My daughters at the time were at university and were doing kind of hospitality jobs to get them through university. Much as I adore my daughters, this guy was so much better than they would have been, because for him, it was his career, whereas for them, it was kind of a means to an end. And I'm sure they did their job well. But this guy was throwing his all into it and was just so, so, so good. And so there are specific skills that are related to a disability, which can be really beneficial. Then if we think about the reputation of an organization, if you're an inclusive employer of choice, that means you are an employer of choice. So you will attract the very, very best talent, not just the very best disabled talent, but also the best talent generally. Going back to my daughters, they're millennials. When they look for jobs, they're not just looking at salary and annual leave and perks. They're also looking to see if this organization has a social impact, has an environmental impact positively. Is it an ethical organization? Is it authentic? And so they will go for those organizations who are inclusive and are seen as better employers. So actually, by being an inclusive employer of choice, you become an employer of choice. We know that 87% of consumers prefer to patronize companies that employ disabled people. They see it as very much a positive. 92% of consumers feel more favorable towards companies that employ disabled people. And so why wouldn't you want that reputation? And then in terms of morale, we know that 2% of people of working age become disabled or acquire a long-term health condition every year. And so people can see what organizations do with employees who become disabled or acquire a long-term health condition. And if we can see that those people are dealt with in a sympathetic and an empathetic way and are valued and supported and keep their jobs or given different jobs or given support, that really makes you feel this organization is a great one to work for. So whether you're disabled or not, everybody in organizations that employ disabled people, morale is higher. And again, that's been noted in a number of studies. So if you want good morale in your organization, employ disabled people and support them. And then there's the diversity of thought we talked about earlier on. So it avoids groupthink. You've got people who say, why we're doing it that way, that's not going to work. Let's do something different. What we don't want is a group of yes people who will agree with whatever the senior manager says to keep them happy. And then we carry on making decisions that really don't work for everybody. So having that challenge is amazing. Coming up with those new ideas, that innovation, if we want to be ahead of the game, then we really need to think about having people who have diversity of thought, challenging that status quo. We know that decision making is much better with diverse people and that team. And diverse teams generally, it's well documented by lots and lots of studies. This is the famous one that McKinsey did in 2019. But we know that diverse companies are better able to attract talent, improve their customer orientation, their employee satisfaction, decision making, and it leads to a virtuous cycle of increasing retention. We know that organizations who have diverse boards in terms of gender and race and disability are far more productive and profitable, than organizations who aren't. And if we're talking about diversity, then clearly, disability is part of that. We can't be a bit inclusive. We've got to be inclusive of everybody. So just to summarize, really, employing disabled people means we access more talent without losing productivity. There will on average be less sickness absence, fewer workplace accidents, we'll attract more customers, we'll have additional skills, and we'll have enhanced reputation and morale, and we'll have that diversity of thought. So really, it shouldn't be about why should we employ disabled people? It's why on earth wouldn't we employ disabled people? Because the organization gains so much and there is nothing to be lost. There's no downside to this. Sometimes organizations will say, well, the downside is that we might need to spend more money. And yes, occasionally people will need workplace adjustments. Usually they're free. Often it's diverse, flexible working maybe, or working from home, or it might be just moving things out of the way so that people don't fall over them. Sometimes it might be things that cost money. It might be assistive technology. It might be an ergonomic chair. If that's the case, we have access to work that will pay for those things. So even the worry about the money it's going to cost is irrelevant. And one of the things that I think now that employing disabled people really gives us is that since the pandemic, we've seen that there's a new way of working. There's a better way of working. Most people now want hybrid working. We don't want to necessarily do the 2-hour commute every day. So people generally, disabled people and otherwise, are saying, let's do things differently now. Let's perhaps work from home sometimes, or let's job share. Let's work more flexibly. Let's work different hours. And if we're working in a different way, what we really need in our organization are people who are used to working in different ways, disabled people. So in this new way of working, disabled people can lead. We can teach organizations how to work in this different, more fluid, more flexible, more innovative way, because it's what we've been doing forever. And so again, employing disabled people is really going to help. So I'm going to open up for questions now, just to mention that I'm happy to answer any questions that you might think about after this webinar. And obviously you can email me on my email address, which is there, and have a look on Evenbreak. And also the book that what I wrote, as Ernie Wise used to say, it's a dozen brilliant reasons to employ disabled people. It's a very conversational book. It's not a heavy academic tone, but what it includes are all the studies and the research that's been done that backs up all of the things I've been saying in this webinar. So it's not just me making it up. These are studies and research that have been published in different parts of the world at different times, and I've brought them all together in one book. That is available on Amazon, but I'm very happy to send you a copy free of charge, because the reason I wrote it wasn't to make money. Nobody makes money on business books. It's not like Harry Potter. Actually, the reason I wrote it was so that people would begin to think about disability differently, so that we're talking about talent, not about pity. So nowhere today have I talked about CSR, about charity of the year, about feeling sorry for people. All I've talked about today are bottom line business benefits, commercial benefits, and nothing to do with morals and ethics and those kinds of things, although those are equally valid. So let me know, email me if what you would like is a copy of the book, and I'm happy to pop one in the post for you. But what I'd like to do now is open up for questions. So if you have any questions or comments, we've only got 5 minutes, so we haven't got a long time for this. But any questions or comments that you have, please pop them into the chat or in Q&A, wherever you prefer. And I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Or any comments, maybe some of the things that we've talked about you've observed in your own organisations. That would be good to hear too. Any stories that you've got to share. If you don't have any questions, that's fine too. I'm hoping that means that I've made it all fairly clear in this webinar. I'll close it now. But as I say, if you have any questions that come up after this webinar that you think, oh, I know what I meant to ask, or perhaps I'd like to ask this privately, please contact me. I'm very, very happy to talk. This is my favourite subject, as you can probably tell. All of us at Evenbreak are passionate about the narrative around disability being seen differently. So we'd be very happy to answer any questions. Oh, thank you. So yeah, somebody's saying this was useful. So I'm glad it was useful. I hope it was useful for everyone. Do email me and I'm happy to send you a copy of the book. It just kind of talks in a bit more depth about what I've been talking about in this webinar, but I'm happy to do that. So do send me an email if you want to be in touch, or have a look at Evenbreak if you want to know more about what we do. And hopefully we'll see you on other events. There is a page on the Evenbreak website. If you look under employers, training and consultancy, all of the events that we've got coming up are on there, and you're very welcome to join any that you'd like to. So yeah, we'd like to keep the dialogue going. Thank you for attending today, and yeah, see you at the next event. Thanks very much.